Raynsford. I am an architectural historian at San Jose State University. Unlike some tonight, I'm not a designer. What I'm here to talk about is my analysis, a little bit, of what exists now and how we might think about the relationship between what exists now and what might exist in the future. So the title of my talk tonight is 6 Typologies of Silicon Valley. Can they connect? And the implication of that question is that they do not yet connect. That Silicon Valley is something like an archipelago of different typologies, little islands in this kind of great sea. It's almost as though we have multiple cities. What is a typology? So typology is a term that refers to the building blocks of a city, both to the buildings and the spaces between the buildings. It has to do with the scale of streets, of parking lots, of buildings, the heights of buildings, how far apart they are, how big the lots are. It is a term that was used by Italian architects to try to diagnose their own cities. And Italians love to walk around their cities and explore them and are very sensitive to this relationship of space to cities. So I'm borrowing this term. And what I want to do is to try to think of a kind of anatomy. What is, if you look at this satellite view of Silicon Valley, get to the nitty-gritty, what are the patterns that already exist if we really look at it deeply enough? And how can we build on this to find a kind of solution? So in my analysis, I discovered about 6 different typologies. The first is the traditional Main Street. And there are many examples of that. University Avenue in Palo Alto, Lincoln Avenue in Willow Glen. People love to walk up and down. The streets are right up next to the sidewalk. We have very pedestrian-friendly space. Often people struggle to find parking. Sometimes they're surrounded by parking structures right behind as in Mountain View. As you know, if you try to go to Mountain View, you probably have to go to a parking structure to walk up and down the street. Nevertheless, this is one of the favorite places for people to go. The buildings are very small scale. This is like one typology then of urban space. The next is the bungalow labyrinth. And of course, all of Silicon Valley is based on a sea of bungalow labyrinths. This was originally designed as an extended garden city. Everybody wanted an individual bungalow with fruit trees around. And so now we have, of course, in the post-war period, an expansion of this. There's an example in Palo Alto, lovely kind of circles, and you can imagine people getting lost at night, going around. But it's a very definite typology, right? We see this all over Valley. They're not necessarily connected to other things, however. You have a hard time finding the edges. The next is the boulevard. So the boulevards are like the linear parks. They serve both cars and people, ideally. So even bicyclists, and you can walk up and down them, you can drive and go places. There are trees. The buildings are set back quite far. They're rather formal. In Silicon Valley, they don't necessarily lead anywhere. The exception here is Palm Drive in Stanford with that beautiful view right towards the campus. And of course, the Arboretum on all sides is probably the most grandiose version of a boulevard that we have here in Silicon Valley. So the next typology is what I call the porous perimeter block. And you probably see these rising up now all over as Silicon Valley becomes denser. You see these blocks, sometimes they're next to train stations, sometimes they're just across the street from used car lots, apartments on the exterior, courtyards on the interior, so there's actually a kind of urban space on the interior. Sometimes they're streets, sometimes they're private. Sometimes it seems a little random where one pops up, and we find that this is a new typology that is just beginning to develop, but it seems not yet quite to have been assimilated with the other typologies. The other is the edge city. You see edge cities all over the world. They are these places that have sprouted up on the periphery wherever freeways come together. We see seas of parking, very large lots, very large buildings in the middle of these lots. Sometimes there are pedestrian areas that are stranded in the middle of these as well. These are also very strong typologies that are not necessarily connected to the other typologies that we see around them. You have to drive to them usually. The edges are usually quite difficult. You never really want to be walking around the edge of an edge city. The next is the high-tech campus. This is where a lot of people work, and they're very distinguished architectural pieces very often, as in the SGI headquarters now, the Googleplex, or the Apple Campus 1. Places of intense socialization on the interior. On the exterior, however, often nothing but trees, perhaps parking lots. Again, not really connected necessarily to the rest of the city around. So again, we have a very strong urban typology. This one actually is not unique to Silicon Valley, at least quite dominant within it. And so when we begin to think about these things, we want to begin to ask, can they connect? Could, for example, Santana Row, instead of being marooned in an edge city, actually connect to a boulevard that goes somewhere else, so that that street actually makes sense in relation to other parts of the city? So two typologies that might in fact overlap. Or can these campuses, for example, be connected to traditional main streets? Could they have different kinds of edges so that there is some relationship between the public periphery and this more private corporate space within, so that people inside could also go out for lunch on one of these streets? Or, for example, these bungalow labyrinths, could they be connected to these perimeter blocks? Could the blocks be, in fact, surround a group of bungalows so that one has a sense they could become protected walls in some sense for the small houses within? Some sort of relationship between them. Or these edge cities and the traditional main street, could they begin to layer into one another so that you have some main streets that begin to cross over into the edge city? I mean, so we have some sort of connectivity, you might say, among these various typologies. Thank you.